Okay, let me pull this up. So I'm not going to get into the etymology of this stuff, but I looked up several. The synergism has a theological definition, but the idea would be, I think this is one of the better ideas that's meant by the Calvinists who basically invented this word. Like in medicine, it might be the joint action of two or more agents, such as drugs or muscles, to produce a greater effect than the sum of their individual effects. That's like a medical context. The Cambridge Dictionary says, is the simultaneous or cooperative effect of two or more agents or factors. In other words, it's two bodies working together to accomplish something. Okay. One definition I saw was, which probably captures the theological distinction wanting to be made by Calvinists, two discrete bodies coming together to work towards a goal, something like that. Because every Christian historically and currently, I would argue, in a really even with a really big tent, would everybody say historically and presently, of all stripes, that man and God are very much discrete entities, right? As well as in other ancient classic theologies. So we might ask, like, what is the problem with synergy? A lot of people don't want to, especially the once saved, always saved crowd that aren't Calvinists. They tend to want to say, no, I'm not a synergist. It depends on how careful you're wanting to be with what's being meant. You want to appease the Calvinists? Well, they won't be appeased until you just denounce Pelagianism and believe God determines everything, because that's the ultimate outcome of their position, even though many of them would not hold those views or understand that that's where their trajectory is headed in being consistent. All the scholars and philosophers and thinkers of Calvinism understand this. You have to bite the bullet. Ultimately, you have to say God determines all sin, every event that occurs. Yes, double predestination is true. All things that occur are for the glory of God, and God indeed wanted secretly. I would phrase it this way. People may not like it, but you ultimately believe that Adam and Eve were to fall, and it couldn't have been any other way. So God secretly set them up to fall for his purpose, his divine purposes. And so God ultimately gets the credit for everything that happens, and to state otherwise ultimately would be claiming synergism. And many of them would say you can't stand God. I've been listening to different Calvinists of different stripes. Some of them know me, some of them don't. Some of them knew I'm present listening, some of them don't. But they seem to have the idea that we think it's all about our free will. Well, I'll tell you this. It is in this sense. I don't want to pretend like God is the one who's ultimately at fault for my sin, other than that he created me. No, I am guilty for my sin because I didn't have to do it. Because if I had to, I would be a victim, because sin is evil and God punishes evil because he is good. So really it's not about me. But although if your view is correct, it would be true that I think what I do because God determined me to think that way. And if you think that's silly, that's your view. That is what you believe. I don't believe that. You believe that. It's an internal critique. So you may not like that. That's the implication, but it's almost like you forget you're trying. I mean, are we supposed to pretend like your view isn't true until you want to wield it? Because that is your view. I believe what I believe because God determined it. Are you trying to thwart God's will? Does he want me to believe something else and I'm resisting it? Who are you, a man, to think that you can change my mind when God has determined me to believe thus for his glory? But that aside, we'll pretend like that inconsistency isn't actually a thing that's really problematic for your view, because no one can live that way, obviously, which is probably a hint that it's not correct. What is synergism? Let's go there. When I read the Bible, I think it so obviously assumes free will. I don't even know where to start. I've worked really hard at trying to see it the other way, but there's so many verses that are so impossible to read. In other words, if the writer thought the same distinctions that the determinist is wanting to make with the text, if those, like, think about it, we're just reading it and seeing it a different way. You think it's forced upon the text, and so we have to interpret everything through that way. If it was so important to believe that, why isn't it clearly stated? Why are there verses that you would never say or write if those distinctions were important? You would never write first. People don't get this. You don't write 1 Corinthians 10:13 if the distinctions that the Calvinists are wanting to make about how it works were true. You would, if Paul was thinking that, he wouldn't write 1 Corinthians 10:13 because it would only seek to confuse. He wouldn't say things like, you have to examine yourself to see if you're in the faith. You must save yourself and those around you. It's like, if these distinctions were so important, would Paul ever, would they record that in Scripture? You have to save yourself. And this is where I want to start by saying this. My view, I think, is much like the early churches. You need the righteousness of Christ. The question is, how are you going to get it? And that's a decision you have to make. You have to receive it from God. So yes, it is very synergistic. After all, think about the Old Testament. God says things like, what more could I have done? In what context does that make any sense if the distinctions of Calvinism are true? What more could I have done? What sense does it make for Jesus to blame an enemy and condemn somebody who causes something in the spiritual realm too, by the way? He says an enemy has done this. He says that's Satan. That's a spiritual being. It's not a physical entity in our world. So he's talking about things outside of our physical realm. So you'd think that would be the opportunity to explain the theology of it when he's reaching into the spiritual realm where the spiritual battle is happening. The real thing that's Christ is, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. You start getting into that ethereal realm, as it were. Most Christians would see it that way. Probably I would less, but like that's an opportunity to say, well, in that realm, on the highest tier of what's happening in the world between good and evil, seems like it'd be a good opportunity for him to say, God has done this for his glory or something like that. No, an enemy has done this. And that's what Jesus said. He came to destroy the works of the devil, who's a spiritual being, who fell clearly before the world began, or during the beginning, at least. So think about the Old Testament. This idea of long suffering. Like, wouldn't it speak more like God has set things this way so that, he wouldn't say things like he's pleading with them. Let's look at a couple verses. To me, this one just kills once saved, always saved, as well as divine determinism or the denial of a kind of libertarian free will. Like, think about how important, if you're a Calvinist, how important you think your distinctions are. Like, if those things were so important, would you write this? Tell me if you would write this, if those distinctions were so important. Okay. Now it shall come to pass when all these things come upon you, the blessings and the curse which I've set before you. Notice, he's set two things before you. And you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God drives you. and you return to the Lord your God and obey his voice according to all that I command you today, you and your children with all your heart, with all your soul, that the Lord your God will bring you back from your captivity. Now think about being them and hearing this from God. And God says, hey, if you obey me, blessings. If you disobey me, cursings. Does he want them to think there's only one option? Or does he want them to think that there's options before them and that he's encouraging them to obey so he can bless them? Now, they didn't obey. Okay? They didn't obey. We know that ultimately. But when God said this to them, he said it as two options before them. Now, are you going to tell me that God didn't give them this warning, wanting them to obey so that he would bless them? But they didn't. Therefore, God secretly didn't want them to obey for a greater purpose? Do you really want to say that? Because that's not in the text anywhere. You're putting that on top of the text and not deriving it from the text. Don't say you can't obey me. Don't you say that. Notice this. Listen to this. He gives them the blessings and the cursings. This is the commandment which I command you today. It is not too mysterious for you. Don't add to this and make it mysterious. It's not far off. It's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us to bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. So if you're a Calvinist, you're saying they couldn't do it. You're saying they could only do the thing they did, which is not obey, because God determined them not to obey. But here we have God saying, don't say this stuff like, hey, how can we do this thing, or hear it and do it? Or don't say it's beyond the sea, that you should say, who will go over for us and bring it to us that we may hear it and do it? Don't say, we can't do this. We need someone to do it for us. Don't you say that, because it's not true. You know why? Because the word is very near you. It's in your mouth and it's in your heart that you may do it. But they didn't do it. So you call God a liar with your doctrine, and it's wrong. And that verse proves it.